Alongside being educational, reenacting is an awful lot of fun, and if you've been watching this channel for some time, I don't think I really need to convince you of that. And of course, all the time I have people saying to me how they would love the chance to get involved with the hobby, but unfortunately, while so many people have an interest and even a desire to get involved with the reenacting hobby, the community is also, by nature, a highly restrictive one. It's often very expensive. It demands long hours of travel to events, and if you're in the wrong state or country, it can be difficult to even find any groups, let alone authentic ones, that are portraying something that you're interested in. And while I'm not here to discuss whether this sort of thing is right or wrong, a lot of groups will also restrict membership based on age, sex, and ethnicity in order to more authentically reflect the genuine historical makeup of the organizations which they portray. Reenacting is a highly restrictive hobby. But for those who cannot get involved with reenactment for one reason or another, there is another mode of historical simulation which might possibly capture that same milieu in a more accessible way. Video games, where the only requirement to get involved is a computer and a willingness to actually play. Holdfast Nations at War is one such game which attempts to do just that. It's a third-person multiplayer shooting game set in the Napoleonic Wars, where, unlike many titles set in this time, the player takes control not of an army, but of an individual soldier. And every figure on the screen, every musician, every ensign, every soldier, and every officer are all represented by individual people who actually form online regiments and get together at scheduled times to play together in events called line battles, where they attempt to utilize period-appropriate drill and techniques to actually fight. But while the organization of these events and the willingness of these players to operate with command structures and linear tactics is really quite impressive, the question does remain: just how historically authentic is Holdfast Nations at War? To answer this question, I was invited to attend a few such events with the Queen's Royal Regiment, whose information I will include in the description down below. Now, I should say, before I go any further, that I enjoyed these events a great deal, and I think that Holdfast, regardless of its accuracy, is still a fun game, and I must thank the QRR for inviting me to play with them and be able to record all of the action for this video. Now, because I want to discuss the overall authenticity of the game's line battles, which are easily the main pull of the title, I'm not going to get myself bogged down in its minutiae, because, as I'm sure you're all well aware, I could probably go on for a few hours about every incessant little detail inside the game, from everything from the musket design to the uniforms to the sound effects and everything in between. Suffice to say, in all of those regards, the game is passable. It's certainly not the worst example, but there are plenty of ways I think that they could improve the game's historical accuracy on that more physical asset sort of level. So let's go straight into the game's actual mechanics and how they work in relation to the real movements and drilling of the Napoleonic Wars, because as you may expect, authentic drill among the soldiers is easily the most important basis on which to establish an authentic line battle. Now, the first thing that struck me in this regard was, honestly, just how simplistic the game really was. I mean, Holdfast is essentially a more polished version of the game Mount and Blade Napoleonic Wars, which in turn started off as a modified version of the game Mount and Blade Warband, which is a more medieval-based game. And because its base was medieval in nature, Mount and Blade Napoleonic suffers from a variety of historical issues. Muskets aren't held in the proper way, men don't march in proper time, the reloading animations are clunky and simplistic, but all of that was more understandable because it was operating off of an engine designed for swords and pikes and bows, and of course the game was also much older. But Holdfast, on the other hand, is a newer title that is specifically being designed to the Napoleonic Wars. It is, as a title, able to be designed from the ground up with black powder weapons, drilling, and techniques in mind. But unfortunately, Holdfast has not really improved on these initial mistakes in Mount and Blade in a very significant way. While the game is certainly much better polished, and its character models are far more authentic than some of the abominations that you see in Mount & Blade, the actual mechanics of Holdfast are largely similar. The most immediate thing that I noticed was that all of the men are always at the port arms. When they were standing still, when they're advancing, when they're loading, that was always the default position that they go back to. There is no shoulder arms, no advance arms, no recover, no trail, just the port. But why? It doesn't really change the gameplay itself, I acknowledge, but why not have a few different positions? When the men are standing still, they ought to be in the position of a soldier under arms, which is to say, with their muskets shouldered on their left side. The only real situation historically in which a soldier should be advancing at the port arms like this is right before they come to the charge bayonets, so why not have that be the default position of a soldier when they are in the bayonet mode? And then, when they reach a particular range, perhaps to an enemy unit, then they automatically drop to the charge with a cry of huzzah. That way, not only do you have a clearly visible indicator of when soldiers are pushing with bayonets and when they're firing, depending on the mode of the weapon they have selected, which not only makes it easier, of course, for officers commanding, but then you're also able to have a whole line pushing with bayonets, and you can have them all drop to the charge more or less simultaneously, or perhaps it can even be done at the command of an officer. The officer unit presses a button, and all of their men do that particular thing, which would look absolutely stunning if you were able to get it right. Now, similar to the position of their arms being inaccurate, the actual pacing of the soldiers is also totally wrong. You see, in the game, you have one of two options on how you want your character to move. You have walk very quickly, and you have run. Whereas they ought to have at least two, maybe even three, different walking speeds if you wanted to keep an accurate Napoleonic drilling style. First off, you have the ordinary time, which you can see here. It's the slowest pace at 75 steps per minute and is the default movement speed for soldiers, or at least British soldiers, during the Napoleonic Wars. Because of its slow pace, it's best to maintain one's unit cohesion and keep in line, something which, as we'll see, is sorely missing from Holdfast. Note how it also has a very specific movement of the leg as well, which is something I think which would look absolutely great in a game setting if only the developers would include it. Then you have the quick time at 108 steps per minute, which, as you can see here, is a far more rapid pace. Now, because of the speed, it can be harder in this pace to maintain one's dressing, but it's best when you need to press your enemy in the field or move about very quickly for whatever reason. Note, however, that it is not running. Even the next highest pace, the wheeling time, also called the quickest time, which is about 120 steps per minute, is just a very rapid walk, not a run. To run in the field of battle is, generally speaking, not a good idea. It becomes almost impossible if you're running to keep your unit's cohesion, and it tires the men. While it may be appropriate in the skirmishing sizes of the Holdfast games here at around 150 men at a time, in any real engagement between actual companies of men in linear battles, the type that Holdfast is attempting to portray, it's an absolutely ridiculous thing to do, unless, of course, the unit has already broken and the discipline has gone, or when you're in a bayonet charge and perhaps you've reached within exceptionally close range of the enemy, which is standing its ground. And even then, it'd represent a mistake in the field to break discipline, break ranks, and charge at the foe, because it does just make you that much more vulnerable to being sort of picked off piecemeal, as certain aspects of the line reach the enemy before other aspects of it do. But in Holdfast, you can only run. As there's no stamina system in the game, and cohesion is almost impossible to keep anyways, there's no real reason to ever use the slower pace, even if it is more accurate for the troops to use that as their default. And as there's no quick march, you just have all the men running around everywhere in very loose so-called lines and columns, which just looks silly and is incredibly far removed from the genuine experience of the Napoleonic Wars, which, in a very stark contrast to the open order tactics of the American War of Independence, were dominated by massive, steady-moving, condensed blocks of infantry, which is what you needed in order to defend against the much larger cavalry cavalry formations which were present in the European setting. Now, as usual, there's an awful lot more that I could talk about in this category. I mean, honestly, I could go on for ages just about the bayonet fighting mechanics on their own. I mean, look, it just looks absolutely ridiculous, but no. But the thing that I really want to talk about within this game, the thing that really matters most, I think, is actually the community itself and how authentic their actual methods are when fighting in these line battles. While you can certainly have a lot of fun playing the game by just joining in and playing a random match, the real meat of the title is found in the large, community-organized line battles, where teams of players will actually line up and march in linear formations, firing back and forth in volleys and listening to commands by their officers. And again, I must extend my warmest thanks to the QRR for inviting me to play with their group. And you must understand, my dear viewer, that all of the complaints that I am about to make are not in any way specific to this group of people, as I've seen the exact same issues with numerous other groups within the game as well. Because unfortunately, due to both mechanical issues within the game itself and honestly, a general lack of knowledge of period-appropriate drill, at least compared to good reenactors out there. You know, perhaps it's on the same level as some of the more Farby ones out there, but, you know, a general lack of period-appropriate drill. While these line battles certainly do have an historical flair, they aren't terribly authentic or accurate. So, what do I actually mean by that? Well, for starters, despite the benefit of video games over proper reenacting that I detailed at the start of the video, the majority of these battles never actually reach beyond a maximum server size of around 150 men, and so the individual units that move around, while certainly a decent size for a reenactment type unit, well, they're hardly historically appropriate. A Napoleonic line ought to consist of numerous companies of anywhere from 20 to 100 men, all brigaded together and operating in large lines to protect each other's flanks, particularly from the threat of cavalry. But here in the game, we have 5 or 6 separate groups of 10, all running around a massive map with incredible gaps between them all. Because there's no cavalry in the game, there's very little reason for units to even fight cohesively at all, because each unit need not fear being cut off or surrounded so rapidly. The relatively tiny scale of these units also lends itself to a simplifying of the drill. You don't really need to know how to authentically move from column into line, or how to fire by sections, how to properly wheel, or what the proper procedures are for firing and retiring, when you're only dealing with a half dozen men, and you can just say, get into this formation, or hey guys, go over there. And it's honestly so much easier than the long-winded formality of command, which is far more period appropriate because of the scale of conflict. And the actual movement system in the game as well, and the fact that everyone is dealing with keyboards and mouses rather than their own 2 feet, means that it's almost impossible, no matter how hard the unit tries, to actually keep in proper dressing. You know, there's only 2 default movement speeds, so if you fall behind, you've fallen behind. You can't extend your pace. You can't try and fix your dressing in any way while on the move. And because of this, lines are always buckling, they're bending and twisting. It's impossible to properly advance in line across a field, and so the players are always forced to turn into a single file column and simply run across the field in extremely loose Indian files, as if they were so many snakes coiling around the battlefield, rather than actual military formations. What I would have loved to see was some sort of a movement guidance system, if you will, that could actually speed up or slow down individual models so that they could all keep more or less in an actual line formation as arranged by an officer or NCO type unit. Just something, anything that could mean that units were actually capable of advancing as singular, solid blocks across the terrain, keeping their dressing and acting as one. Because even if the game did have proper numbers with proper-sized units moving across the field, it's almost impossible for these units to actually operate in 2 or 3 ranks, so things like firing in ranks are wholly unnecessary and are in no way accommodated for within the actual mechanics of the game, let alone being sought after among its community. whereas in the real Napoleonic Wars, the idea of going around in only a single rank would be more or less ridiculous, as you immediately cut your firepower by half or even 2/3, to say nothing of how a thin and loose formation again would immediately be vulnerable to cavalry attack. And because of this simplicity in the game's mechanics, in order to play, you really only have to know a very small selection of actual commands. Left and right face, present and fire, forward march, things like that. And sadly, even those commands which would otherwise make sense and feasibly be done within the game's mechanics are often either gotten wrong or even wholly ignored. Take, for example, moving from column into line, which, considering all movement in the game is done in column for the reasons previously discussed, you would think that would be an incredibly useful thing to be able to do in the game, be able to move from a column into line. Now, the way that I would like to see this movement done, the way within the game which is as close as you can get to the reality of the drill, would be, on the issue of the command, to have the front man in the column immediately go to the game's walking speed, call it a half step, shall we. He would continue to advance as the man immediately to his rear, while continuing in the running speed, would move up to either his left or right, however the unit wishes to form its front. Now, immediately upon running up to the first man, the second man switches over again to the slower walking speed. The third man, meanwhile, is doing the exact same thing, lining up with the second, and so on and so forth, all at once, meaning that the line ought to move from column into line without actually having to stop itself, which is pretty much at least how it was done historically, with, of course, some additional complications with added ranks and the like. Then, of course, as the last man enters into step with the newly formed line, the officer can again cry out the command to move to the running speed, even if that running speed is ridiculously far in its own right. But instead of doing this, most groups within the game make up their own drill to what suits the game best, rather than drawing from the military manuals directly in an attempt to gain that more authentic military experience. What I saw these groups doing instead is having their entire column sort of extend itself to the appropriate direction at the same exact speed, meaning that for a good while the entire line would be running at a diagonal angle before the front man would stop and everyone else would then run forward to form a line. And not only do you have to stop the entire formation to form the line in this situation, but you add layers of complexity which are wholly unnecessary and which honestly just frustrate the cohesion of the line, opening it up to counterattack for an extended period of time. Honestly, when you're in a diagonal line like that, with one man in front of you and to the right and the other one behind you and to the left, who are you supposed to take your dressing by? Well, you can't take your dressing, and the way that I saw this pseudo-command usually wind up is that men would take either far too short a spacing between themselves, or they would extend way too far, and it would just take more time for the line to stop and have everyone catch up and actually arrange themselves into a proper line. Whereas, if they did it in the more seamless, I think, and the more period-appropriate way, the way that you would get if you read the actual drill manuals, it would work out much better, I think. Another thing which I thought was really weird, which sort of, showcased that these people do clearly know about the time period, but that they also didn't really have a very intimate knowledge of the genuine drill, the way that a reenactor, or at least, again, a good reenacting unit, would be expected to achieve, would be actually when we were learning how to wheel. When we were learning how to wheel on the center, either left or right, so basically, rather than pivoting like a door, you're pivoting on the center of the formation, that's where you're taking your dressing from. Well, when the command came to actually execute the wheeling, the command should have come as something along the lines of, company will wheel to the right, on the center, march. Instead, what they said was something along the lines of, clock formation to the right, and clock formation to the left. They didn't refer to it as wheeling, but as clock. Because, I suppose, that's sort of a way to describe wheeling, is you're moving like the arm on a clock. Sort of like how you might describe it as being the hinge on a door, which is another very popular way to describe wheeling. But it's not the actual command. And when I mentioned that, then I mentioned, oh, well, why don't you say wheeling? It was pointed out, well, yeah, I guess so. It's the same thing. We just always call it clock. So while they were doing the right thing, they were wheeling, and they knew what wheeling was, they didn't recognize the actual terminology for it. Again, it betrays sort of a lack of awareness of the period-appropriate drill, which I think would really help these communities to make the game a lot more interesting and fun, and as well, a bit more educational. But of course, this isn't usually too much of an issue, because, like I said, in the actual battles, the only real commands that you need to know are your facings, march, halt, and fire, because, honestly, in my experience, that's about as complex as it usually got. It's not so much a game of linear warfare, so much as it was a bunch of snakes just running wildly around a map before turning left, firing, and then snaking back off again. Another thing that really rubbed me the wrong way, and it's not, I admit, really a terribly big deal, but I honestly think that it captures quite well my overall issues with the actual game. That being that when we were firing our volleys in the line battle, our commanders would always tell us to left face when we were reloading. Now, coming from my reenacting perspective, this made absolutely no sense to me. Everything in the drill book, from the marching to the loading, emphasizes the singular point, and this is in Napoleonic drill, not American War of Independence drill, because it's different there, but everything in Napoleonic drill emphasizes the singular point exceptionally clearly, that a soldier is to, at all times, remain squared to his front, and only ever cast his head about slightly when dressing the ranks, and even then he ought to be barely turning his head. To have the men left face whenever they were reloading would not only slow down one's rate of fire, but because you're dealing with these very long muskets, it would actually make it more difficult to reload. There is no instance in the drill manuals, or certainly ever historically that I've ever heard of soldiers turning left to reload. That sort of thing is a mark of a soldier that does not know how to properly reload when in two ranks. Sadly, it is something that we do see in reenactment, but again, it's because a soldier has not been properly drilled on how to reload his gun while he's in the second rank. So, I asked the group why we were doing this, where the idea came from, because I had never read anything like it before. To which the answer came, it reduces the hitbox. AKA, it makes you a smaller target in game. And that, I think, summarizes my feelings on Holdfast quite well. That rather than making changes within the game itself to accommodate historical authenticity, it sacrifices history in the name of more simplistic gameplay. And this is the result of both the game's community and its actual mechanics. But honestly, though, I do have to respect the community a great deal for at least one thing, in that they do organize themselves in an incredibly impressive fashion and fight in these lines, because by far the most efficient way to play the game is really just to form two formless, irregular blobs of men. So even if history is ignored in many ways to accommodate playing the game efficiently, the community does still clearly care, and their historical intent is not wholly foregone. And again, I must respect them for that. If I was to describe Holdfast Nations at War in a few words, I wouldn't label it as a genuine Napoleonic third-person shooter. It would be more accurate, I think, to call it an online third-person shooter with a Napoleonic skin. It has a very strong historical aesthetic, with more or less decent character models and a lot of historical flavor, but it's not an historically authentic experience, and it has very little value in actually educating people about this period beyond the most simplistic, the most basic of materials, and it certainly does not even begin to approach an authentic recreation of linear conflict. All of that said, of course, I did still have a great time actually playing the game, both as a random pubbie in the lobbies and when taking part in these formal line battles. It's still a fun game, and I do hope that it might serve as a basis for future titles with a stronger mind towards authentic historical recreation. Certainly, the popularity of games like this one, and like Mount and Blade Napoleonic Wars, as well as the upcoming War of Rights and Whigs and Tories, it really does show, I think, very clearly that people are interested in this period of history and the genre, if you can call it such, of linear warfare shooters. And I really do look forward to seeing how this new kind of ultra-cooperative online shooter can develop, with just a little more attention to historical authenticity, as well as historical flavor and aesthetic. Thank you once again to the Queen's Royal Regiment for inviting me to play the game with them. I really did have a great time. Thank you again as well to Mr. Eric Sines and General Washington, Victory or Death, for so generously sponsoring this video. And thank you, Oberst, for buying me this game and making this video possible. And of course, until the next time, to all of my dearest viewers, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.